The night before my wedding should have been filled with excitement, nerves, maybe even a few happy tears, but instead, it turned into the kind of nightmare that burns itself into your memory and never leaves. My name is Claire Donovan. I was 19 years old, a military police trainee at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I thought I had seen enough harshness in training to handle anything life threw at me. I was wrong. What happened that night in Savannah cut deeper than any drill instructor's bark, deeper than any bruise I had gotten on the obstacle course. It was the sound of betrayal breaking bones and trust all at once. I had come home for what my mother Susan called a family tradition. She said every bride in our family spent the last evening before her wedding under her mother's roof sharing stories and drinking tea together. I wanted to believe it was genuine. I wanted to believe she was trying to bridge the distance that had stretched between us since she married Rick Holloway, my stepfather. Rick was a man who liked control more than love. He measured strength by intimidation. He measured respect by fear. I knew he disapproved of me wearing a uniform. He said no soldier girl would ever make a proper wife. I had heard those words more than once, usually laced with whiskey and bitterness. But I never imagined he would go this far. That night, Susan brought me a cup of tea on a tray. The steam curled up, and for a moment I thought maybe she was trying to be tender. The china cup rattled just a little in her trembling hands, but I ignored it. I took a sip. The taste was faintly bitter, but I had been exhausted from final fittings planning and travel, so I convinced myself it was only nerves. A heaviness started pulling at me almost instantly. My eyelids felt like sandbags. I remember blinking hard, trying to shake it off. I whispered, "Mom, what did you put in this?" My words slurred thick and heavy, and I saw her mouth open as if to answer, but then Rick's shadow filled the doorway. He was holding something behind his back. My last clear memory before darkness pulled me under was the reflection of the ceiling light glinting off the polished wood of a baseball bat. I collapsed sideways, my body limp, and then came the sound that still makes my stomach clench every time I think of it. Crack! It was the unmistakable sound of bone giving way. White-hot pain shot up my leg, even though my mind was half numb from whatever was in that tea. The scream that tore from my throat was muffled, strangled because the drugs were dragging me down. I could barely move, but I could still feel everything. I heard my mother cry out in a whisper, "Rick, stop, please, she is still our daughter." But her voice was too weak, too afraid. Then came another sound, a laugh light and cruel from my younger half-sister Amber. She had her phone out. I caught the glow of the screen and her voice sharp as broken glass. "Now, let's see the brave soldier limp down the aisle." The words sliced into me worse than the bat. In that moment, consciousness flickered. Pain clawed at every nerve, but shame was even sharper. I, who had stood at Fort Benning with a rifle in my hands and boots in the mud, reduced to this broken mess on the floor of my childhood home, betrayed by the people who should have protected me. My head spun, the room tilted, and then nothing. Only silence. When I opened my eyes again, hours later, fluorescent hospital lights stabbed into me. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the beeping of machines, the weight of a splint on my left leg told me I had not dreamed it. A doctor's voice was explaining something about a non-displaced fracture of the tibia pain management crutches. Words floated past me like smoke. All I could think was, my wedding is in less than 12 hours. Rick thought he had won. He thought by breaking my body he had broken my spirit. He thought by drugging me into weakness he could erase the soldier in me and leave only a scared girl. But he underestimated what lives inside a soldier. He underestimated what love can ignite in someone who has nothing left to lose. Because what he did not know was waiting at the chapel tomorrow was Ethan Cole, my fiancé, a Navy SEAL who had seen more darkness than Rick could imagine. And Ethan was not a man who trembled. He was a man who made others tremble. That realization cut through the fog of drugs and pain like a knife. My leg throbbed, my head swam, but inside me something rose up fiercer than fear. The night before my wedding, they tried to break me. Tomorrow I would walk, even if I had to use crutches, even if every step felt like fire in my bones. Tomorrow I would not be their victim. Tomorrow they would face the truth. My name is Claire Donovan. I was 19 years old when all of this happened, standing at a crossroads between the strict discipline of my military life and the suffocating grip of my family. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, a city of magnolia trees, cobblestone squares, and whispers that traveled faster than the river tides. To outsiders, my family looked perfect. My mother, Susan, kept our house pristine, always with candles burning and curtains pressed. My stepfather, Rick Holloway, owned a small but successful auto repair shop on Abercorn Street. My younger half-sister, Amber, played the role of golden child charming neighbors with her wide smile and glossy hair. But the truth inside those walls was nothing like the image outside. My real father had been a police officer in Chatham County. When I was 8 years old, he was killed in a traffic stop gone wrong. That night, my world cracked. My mother changed almost overnight. She carried grief like armor sharp and cold, and within 2 years, she remarried. Rick was supposed to be a protector, a step-in father figure, but instead he became the source of fear that stalked every room of my childhood home. He was a man who demanded control, who believed every woman under his roof existed to serve his authority. At first, it was small things. He criticized how I sat at the dinner table, how my voice carried too much when I was excited, how my clothes looked too modest or too plain compared to Amber's bright dresses. But then the discipline turned into punishment. When I joined JROTC in high school, Rick tore up the permission slip saying no daughter of his would march around like a boy. I forged another slip, and when he found out, he slapped me so hard, my cheek carried the mark for days. My mother looked away, whispering it was better not to provoke him. That was her mantra for every bruise, every sharp word, every slammed door. Better not to provoke him. Amber never faced his wrath. She was his darling, his princess, the one who could do no wrong. If Amber skipped class, it was because the teachers failed her. If Amber overspent on clothes, it was because she deserved the best. And when she mocked me, calling me Sergeant Serious or Private Nobody, Rick laughed along, clapping her on the shoulder as if she had made the cleverest joke in the world. Growing up in that house taught me 2 lessons. First, silence protects abusers. Second, strength must be built in secret. I spent hours at school libraries learning about West Point, about military police, about service that demanded courage instead of compliance. I ran laps around Forsyth Park long before dawn, training my body into something Rick could not break. And when the time came, I enlisted. Fort Benning, Georgia became my refuge. The drills were brutal, the heat suffocating, the instructors relentless, but for the first time in my life, the pain had purpose. Blisters on my feet meant I had earned another mile. Sore muscles meant I had pushed through another obstacle. Every uniform inspection reminded me I belonged to something bigger than the Holloway household. When I wore that uniform, I was not Rick's scapegoat. I was a soldier in training, a protector, a woman who could stand on her own. My mother never forgave me for it. She said no man would ever marry a girl who carried a gun. She said uniforms were for boys and wives should focus on children. But I carried my father's badge in my pocket every day at Fort Benning, the metal worn smooth by my fingers. It reminded me of what true service meant, and it gave me strength when exhaustion tried to crush me. That strength led me to Ethan Cole. I met Ethan Cole during a training exchange at Pensacola when I was still fresh in my uniform. He was 22, a Navy SEAL already carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen shadows most people never glimpse. He was not the loudest voice in the room, not the type to boast about medals or deployments, but when he looked at you, it felt like he saw straight through the walls you had built. I remember the first time we spoke. I was running drills on the range, my grip tight, my arms sore when he stopped by and simply said, "Your stance is strong, but your eyes are stronger." No one had ever noticed my eyes before. In my family, they only noticed my flaws, my supposed failures, my inability to be Amber. Ethan noticed my will, and that made all the difference. We started with short conversations, shared meals at the base cafeteria, quiet walks when schedules allowed. I told him pieces of my past, the weight of living under Rick's thumb, the way my mother and sister measured my worth only by how invisible I could make myself. Ethan listened without interruption. When I finished, he did not tell me I was exaggerating or suggest that family loyalty should come before truth. He said, "Claire, you are stronger than what they tried to make you. You survived their house, which means you can survive anything." I believed him. Over months, that belief grew into something deeper. He met me in Savannah one weekend, saw with his own eyes the careful show my mother and Rick put on for neighbors, the way Amber preened like a queen at a pageant. When we left, he whispered, "Claire, you do not owe them your obedience. You owe yourself your freedom." That was when I knew I loved him. A year later, he proposed in Forsyth Park beneath the giant oaks draped in Spanish moss. He knelt not with grandeur, but with certainty, offering me a ring and a promise. He said, "I will stand with you in every battle, even the ones inside your own family." I said yes, not because of the ring, but because he had already proved his vow. Planning our wedding became its own battlefield. I wanted something intimate, meaningful, a ceremony at Christ Church on Johnson Square in Savannah, where history seeped through every stone. My mother wanted a spectacle. She wanted a guest list filled with city officials, businessmen, church leaders. She wanted to use my wedding as her stage to shine brighter than ever. Rick wanted control over every detail from the music to the seating chart, reminding me at every turn that he was still the man in charge. And Amber wanted to be the star, demanding to be maid of honor, selecting gowns more glamorous than my own. Every decision became a tug of war. I compromised on flowers, on catering, even on the number of guests. But I refused to compromise on one thing: the ceremony would honor the love between Ethan and me, not the image my family tried to project. That refusal only sharpened Rick's hatred. He muttered more than once that a soldier was no bride, that Ethan would regret marrying someone who thought like a man. My mother stood silent, her silence more painful than Rick's words. Amber fueled the fire with mockery, smirking that maybe Ethan only loved me because he felt sorry for me. Yet even through their contempt, I held on to the vision of that aisle, that moment, when Ethan and I would face each other before God and commit to building something new. I thought the worst they could do was make planning miserable. I thought once the day came, all they could do was sit and watch. I was wrong. Rick was not content to wound me with words. He wanted to break me in a way that everyone would see. He wanted to make sure that when I walked into that church, if I walked at all, the whispers would be about my weakness, not his cruelty. Looking back now, I can see the pattern. Every step of my life had been about control, about him tightening his grip whenever I tried to pull free. And my mother, trapped in her own fears, allowed it. Amber thrived on it. I had escaped to Fort Benning, but on the eve of my wedding, he found one more way to remind me that in his eyes, I was still under his rule. That night would prove him wrong. That night would start the unraveling of his control forever. The months leading up to the wedding were supposed to be joyful, filled with anticipation and hope. But in my family, they became an unending storm of conflict. Every small detail was turned into a battlefield, every choice I made questioned, belittled, or twisted, until I felt like I was fighting just to breathe. Rick's opposition was constant and sharp. From the moment Ethan and I announced our engagement, he spat the same bitter refrain, "No soldier girl will ever make a proper wife." He repeated it at the dinner table in the garage, even once when the pastor visited, his voice dripping with disdain. He wanted me to hear it echoing in my sleep, and sometimes it did. My mother Susan rarely contradicted him. Her silence was its own weapon, one that cut without words. She would sit with her perfect posture, lips pressed in a thin line, eyes fixed anywhere but on me. That silence screamed that she had chosen her peace over my pain. And Amber, my younger half-sister, thrived in the chaos. She had always been the golden child, the one who never felt the sting of Rick's hand, the one whose mistakes were smoothed away with excuses. When we started planning the ceremony, Amber demanded the role of maid of honor. It was not a request. She strutted into my room one evening, tossing her glossy hair, saying, "Of course I'll be maid of honor, Claire. You owe me that much for being stuck as your sister." She picked out dresses that shimmered like something for a red carpet, gowns designed to outshine my own. When I objected, she rolled her eyes and told me no one would notice me anyway. Rick backed her up, saying, "Let her have this, Claire. She deserves it." The irony made me sick. What I deserved was never part of the conversation. Then came the arguments about the guest list. I wanted an intimate ceremony, friends from Fort Benning, people who had walked with me through the mud and the sweat, the kind of people who knew my worth. Rick sneered at the suggestion. He wanted city officials, local businessmen, and members of the church council. He wanted to transform my wedding into his showcase, his proof that the Holloway family stood above the rest. Susan supported him, saying it would reflect well on our family. Every name I added from my own list was scrutinized, questioned, often struck through in red pen on the kitchen counter, while Amber giggled that my soldier friends would look out of place in photos. It reached a boiling point over the music. I wanted a string quartet simple, dignified, something that would fill the church with warmth. Rick wanted a brass band loud and ostentatious, a spectacle. When I refused, he slammed his fist on the table so hard the glasses rattled. He leaned across to me, his breath thick with bourbon, and hissed, "You think you are stronger now because you wear that uniform? But in this house, I still decide." My mother said nothing. Amber laughed into her phone. That was the night I realized I could not let my guard down for a single moment. If I wanted to survive this wedding with my dignity intact, I would need more than determination. I would need evidence. At Fort Benning, I had learned that preparation was the difference between order and disaster. I started applying that lesson at home. Quietly, secretly, I placed a small camera in my bedroom, tucked near the bookshelf. It was no bigger than a thumb drive, but it had clear audio and video. It was meant for security at the barracks, but I bought one for myself. I told no one, not even Ethan. Part of me felt guilty, like I was betraying my own family by recording them. But then I thought of every bruise, every torn permission slip, every slap and insult. They had never been a family to me, not in the way the word should mean. They were my adversaries, and in adversarial ground, evidence was survival. I checked the footage nightly on my laptop, scrolling through the hours listening to the whispers when they thought I was asleep. I heard Rick muttering about how no soldier would ever outshine him, how he would make sure my wedding was remembered for the right reasons. I heard Amber mocking me to her friends, planning how she would steal the spotlight. And worst of all, I heard my mother agreeing to things that twisted my stomach into knots. She was not just silent. She was complicit. As the wedding day drew closer, the pressure in the house became unbearable. It felt like every conversation was a trap, every room heavy with unspoken threats. Rick grew more unpredictable, his temper sharp as a whip. One evening when I came home from a final dress fitting, he blocked the doorway to the living room. His arms were crossed, his shoulders filling the frame, his eyes narrowed with a smug certainty. "You think this wedding is about you?" he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It is about this family, about our name, about how people in Savannah see us. If you embarrass me, you will regret it." The words froze the air in my chest. I wanted to shout back to remind him that it was my vows, my life, my future. But I had learned that his rage fed on defiance. I clenched my fists, nodded once, and walked past him, every step careful, like I was moving through a minefield. Upstairs, I locked my door and whispered to myself, "Record everything, Claire." The camera became my silent ally. Late at night, when the house grew quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner, I played back the footage. I saw the way Rick leaned into my mother, his voice thick with bourbon, whispering that no soldier daughter would humiliate him. I saw Amber twirl in front of my mirror, mocking how ridiculous I would look next to her in the chapel. And once I caught my mother herself practicing lines, words of pity she would tell neighbors if anything went wrong, rehearsing how to paint me as unstable. Watching it all made my stomach churn, but it also sharpened my resolve. They were building their case in shadows. I would build mine in daylight. Ethan called me every evening from Pensacola, his voice steady, grounding me. He told me about his own training, about long swims in the Gulf, about the way his team moved as one. He reminded me that strength was not about size or intimidation, but about discipline and courage. I never told him how bad things were at home. I could not. Pride kept me silent, maybe fear too. I wanted to stand tall beside him on our wedding day, not as a victim but as a partner. Yet every night when I hung up the phone, I sat staring at the laptop screen, listening to the voices in that house, knowing they were plotting something I could not yet see. The rehearsal dinner gave me another taste of humiliation. It was held at the Old Pink House, one of Savannah's finest restaurants. The room glowed with candlelight and polished silverware. Guests toasted, laughed, raised glasses. I wore a modest blue dress, my hair pinned neatly, and Ethan stood beside me, looking every inch the officer he was. For a moment, I thought maybe we would get through the night without disaster. But Rick found his moment. He clinked his glass stood and gave a speech. He spoke about family legacy, about strength and discipline, about how proud he was to see one daughter shining so brightly. He gestured toward Amber, who preened in her seat, and then added almost as an afterthought, "And of course we wish Claire well, too, though she has always been a little too dramatic for her own good." Laughter rippled through the room, nervous, awkward, but still laughter. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, my fists tightening under the table. Ethan's jaw flexed, his hand squeezing mine in silent solidarity, but the damage was done. Rick had managed to reduce me to a side note in my own celebration. On the drive home, I stared out the window, the Spanish moss blurring past, and I thought, this cannot go on. They will not stop until they destroy me. That night, I watched the footage again, my mother whispering about how to hide bruises with makeup, Amber boasting that everyone would look at her first when the doors opened, Rick saying he had a plan that would make me wish I had never worn a uniform. My chest tightened with dread. I did not yet know what that plan was, but I felt it closing in like storm clouds rolling off the coast. 2 nights before the wedding, I overheard a conversation that left my blood cold. I was upstairs in my room, the door cracked just enough to hear voices drifting from the kitchen. Rick was pacing his boots heavy against the tile. He said she thinks she is tougher now that she wears that uniform, but I will show her who runs this family. My mother whispered something I could not make out, her voice shaking, and then Rick's reply came clear as thunder. "If I have to put her down a peg, I will. No soldier girl is going to stand above me in front of this whole town." Amber giggled in the background, and I heard the familiar chime of her phone camera. She was recording something, maybe herself, maybe me, I could not tell. My stomach clenched with the sick realization that they were not just planning to ruin my wedding emotionally. They were preparing for something physical. I checked the camera footage that night and saw enough to confirm my fear. Rick was in my room when I was gone, moving things around, testing angles. Amber filmed him laughing, asking, "What will you do, Daddy," when she limps down the aisle. He smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. That was when I knew he meant to hurt me. The question was not if, but how. My instincts from Fort Benning kicked in. I made contingency plans. I hid the memory card with the recordings in my duffel bag under my uniform. I kept a small notebook with times and details, everything I overheard. I told myself that if the worst happened, I would have proof. But proof does not stop a blow. Proof does not keep bones from breaking. The night before the wedding arrived like a storm I could not stop. My bridesmaids texted excited messages. Ethan called with steady love in his voice. The city lights of Savannah glowed like fireflies outside my window. But inside the house, the air felt poisoned. At dinner, Rick poured himself too many drinks. He watched me over the rim of his glass, his stare slow and deliberate. Amber teased me about tripping in my heels, her laughter sharp and cruel. My mother brought out dessert and said nothing, her silence screaming louder than words. Later, as I packed a few things in my childhood bedroom, I heard the floor creak outside the door. When I opened it, Rick was there. He smiled without warmth and said, "Sleep well, soldier, tomorrow is a big day." Then he walked away, leaving the air heavy with menace. I locked the door and sat on the bed, trembling, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I thought about calling Ethan, about confessing everything, but pride and fear tangled inside me. I wanted to protect him from the ugliness of my family, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could endure whatever they threw at me. Still, I slid the small camera closer to the bed, its tiny red light blinking in the dark, my only witness if something happened. I tried to sleep, but my body would not rest. Memories of Fort Benning ran through my mind, the shouts of drill sergeants, the burn in my legs during ruck marches, the cold steel of the rifle in my hands. Pain is weakness leaving the body, they had told us. But what about pain inflicted not by war, but by the people who were supposed to love you? I stared at the ceiling until my eyes grew heavy. The last sound I remember was the creak of the door opening and my mother's voice, soft and false, saying, "Sweetheart, I brought you some tea to calm your nerves." I should have known the tea was not what it seemed. My mother set it down on the nightstand with shaking hands, her eyes darting toward the hallway as if she feared being caught. I wanted so badly to believe it was a gesture of care, a flicker of the mother I remembered before Rick came into our lives. The steam curled upward, sweet and bitter at once. I lifted the cup, the porcelain warm against my palms, and I drank. Within minutes, the world tilted. My limbs grew heavy, my vision blurred at the edges. I tried to stand, but my knees buckled. I remember whispering, "Mom, what did you do?" But my tongue felt thick, my words slurred. She opened her mouth as if to answer, but the shadow that filled the doorway stole the air from the room. Rick stepped in holding a baseball bat, his face set in the cruel satisfaction of a man who believed he owned the night. My heart hammered. I tried to reach for my phone on the dresser, but my arm moved like it was underwater. I collapsed onto the carpet, my body sluggish, my mind screaming even as my muscles refused to respond. Rick's voice cut through the haze. "You think you can wear that uniform and stand taller than me? Not in this house. Not in this family." My mother's voice cracked. "Rick, stop. Please, she is your daughter." But he ignored her. The bat came down with a sickening crack against my left leg. The sound was sharp and final, like dry wood splitting under pressure. Pain exploded through me. White, hot, blinding. I screamed, or I thought I did, but the drugs muffled everything, turning my voice into a ragged whisper. The agony in my shin was like fire spreading through bone. My vision spotted black. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. I tried to crawl backward, but my leg refused to move, every attempt sending fresh waves of torment tearing through me. My mother sobbed, her hands covering her face, and Amber's laugh pierced the air. She held her phone high, the blue glow reflecting in her eyes. Her voice dripped with mockery. "Look at our brave soldier now. Going to limp down the aisle, Claire. Maybe Ethan will finally see you are nothing." Her laughter sliced me open more than the bat had. I was drowning in pain betrayal pressing on my chest, heavier than any weight I had carried at Fort Benning. My own family, the people meant to protect me, had turned into executioners of my spirit. The drugs pulled me deeper, but I clung to fragments of consciousness. I thought of Ethan, of the way he had looked at me when he proposed under the Spanish moss, of the way his voice steadied mine when doubt crept in. I thought of my father, of the badge I still carried, cool metal worn smooth under my fingers. I thought of every mile I had run before dawn, every blister, every bruise that had shaped me into a soldier. Pain is weakness leaving the body the instructors had drilled into us. But this was not weakness leaving. This was strength being tested. I swore to myself in that blur of agony that if I lived through this night, I would not let them win. The second blow never came. Maybe even Rick thought one was enough. He stood over me, panting, his chest heaving, the bat hanging loosely at his side. He muttered something about teaching me respect and then stormed out of the room. My mother hovered by the doorway, frozen torn between reaching for me and retreating to safety. Amber stayed long enough to film one more clip, my body curled on the floor, my sobs barely audible, and then she followed him. The door slammed shut, and silence filled the room, broken only by my ragged breaths. Hours blurred. I drifted in and out, the pain in my leg, a constant reminder that I was still alive. The drugs dulled nothing, only slowed my movements, chained me in place. I remember staring at the blinking red light of the tiny camera near my bookshelf, the one I had set up as insurance. It had captured everything. Rick's voice, my mother's pleas, the sound of the bone breaking Amber's laughter. For the first time since the bat struck, a flicker of hope sparked in my chest. Evidence. Proof. They had thought to silence me, but in their arrogance they had given me the very weapon I needed. When morning light finally seeped through the blinds, it carried no warmth, only the harsh revelation of what had happened. My leg throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat, each pulse a surge of pain. My throat was raw, my body drenched in sweat. I heard movement in the hall, hurried voices, then suddenly paramedics flooded the room. My mother must have called at some point when the fear outweighed her silence. The stretcher felt like both salvation and defeat. I was being carried out of the house I had grown up in, broken, not by strangers, but by blood. As they lifted me, my eyes locked on Amber. She stood at the top of the stairs, phone still in hand, smirking as if she had won. That look seared into me, but she had no idea what the camera had caught, no idea that the very tools they used to mock me would one day expose them. The ambulance doors shut and the sirens wailed. The night before my wedding, my stepfather drugged me and broke my leg. The pain was real, the betrayal deeper than bone, but somewhere beneath the torment, I held on to one thought. Tomorrow was still my wedding day, and tomorrow they would not be the ones writing the story. The fluorescent glare of the emergency room lights stabbed my eyes when I opened them again. For a moment, I thought I was still trapped in the nightmare, but then I heard the steady beeping of a monitor and felt the cool stiffness of hospital sheets beneath my hands. My leg was elevated, wrapped tight in a rigid splint that stretched from knee to ankle. The pain came in waves, dull, then sharp, as if my body was reminding me not to forget what had happened. A doctor stood at the foot of the bed holding a chart, his voice clinical but not unkind. Non-displaced fracture of the left tibia, he explained. You were lucky it did not shift. We have immobilized it with a splint, and you will need a cast soon. He recommended that I stay for observation 3 to 4 days, warned about swelling, about complications. He mentioned surgery might be required if the bone moved out of alignment. I barely heard half of it. All I could think was that my wedding was hours away. The doctor's tone softened as he added that I had been given medication for the pain and should use crutches if I absolutely had to move. He said in no uncertain terms that I should rest, that pushing myself could worsen the fracture. His words hung in the air like a sentence I could not accept. Rest meant defeat. Rest meant Rick had succeeded. A nurse adjusted the IV and gave me another pill, explaining it would keep the pain tolerable. As it dissolved bitter on my tongue, I thought of Ethan waiting at the church of the vows we had written of the future we had dreamed. I could not let them steal that from me. My mother hovered near the corner of the room, silent, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. She would not meet my eyes. I wanted to scream at her to ask why she let it happen, but the words lodged in my throat. She slipped away when the doctor left, leaving me alone with machines and the faint smell of antiseptic. Time blurred. Nurses checked my vitals, adjusted the splint, wrote notes on charts. My body felt both heavy and restless. The drugs dulled the sharpest edges of pain, but left a gnawing ache deep in the bone. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the crack again, saw Amber's mocking smile. Then came a voice I recognized more than any. Claire. My eyes fluttered open, and I saw Aunt Rachel standing at the foot of my bed. Her presence was like a breath of air in a sealed room. Rachel had been a nurse in the Army for 2 decades, serving in field hospitals where chaos reigned. She carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had seen more pain than most could imagine. She looked at the chart, then at me, then at my leg. You can walk on this with crutches if you are careful, she said quietly, but you should not. I whispered back, I have to. Rachel studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I understand, she said, but if you leave against medical advice. You will need those x-rays, Claire. They are proof. Proof. The word sparked through my fogged mind. She pulled a large envelope from under her arm and tapped it. I made a copy before they filed it. I know you will need it. My chest tightened with gratitude so fierce it almost hurt. Rachel leaned closer, her voice steady. If you walk out of here, you need to know you are not walking alone. I will help you, but this choice is yours. I looked at the ceiling, at the harsh white light, and then back at her. My wedding is not theirs to destroy. I will walk out. Rachel's eyes narrowed with the kind of resolve I had only seen in soldiers before. She moved quickly, checking the hallway, then returned to my bedside. If we do this, we do it clean, she said. She unhooked the IV line with practiced ease and slipped my arm into the sleeve of a hospital gown she had folded to look more like a shawl. Every motion was efficient, steady as if she had done this 100 times in field tents halfway across the world. The nurse would not check for another hour, she whispered, so we had a window. She helped me sit up, and the pain slammed through my shin like a blade of fire. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, refusing to cry out. Rachel steadied me, her arm firm around my waist. The crutches leaned against the wall, already adjusted to my height. She must have planned this before she even walked in. Standing took everything I had. My leg screamed with every shift of weight, the splint stiff and unyielding. The medication dulled the sharpest edge, but could not mask the grinding ache deep in the bone. Sweat broke across my forehead as Rachel whispered slow and steady soldier. Step plant swing. I clung to her rhythm like a lifeline. We moved down the hallway, each step a battle. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The polished linoleum gleamed cold beneath me. Every creak of the crutches echoed like gunfire in my ears. My pulse pounded, fear pressing against my ribs, but determination drove me forward. We reached a side door Rachel had scouted earlier. She swiped her visitor badge across the lock and pushed it open into the humid Savannah night. The scent of wet asphalt hit me, mingling with the salt air drifting from the river. A car idled near the curb, its headlights dim. Rachel had thought of everything. She eased me into the back seat, tucking the X-ray envelope beside me. As she closed the door, I pressed it against my chest like it was armor. Proof. The ride was silent except for the hum of tires on pavement. I stared out the window at the city I had grown up in, the moss-draped oaks blurring past. Memories flashed with every block. Forsyth Park, where I trained in secret before dawn. The school where Rick ripped up my JROTC papers. The church spires that had once symbolized hope, now looming with dread. Rachel finally spoke, her voice low but firm. Claire, you need to know what this means. If you go through with tomorrow, you will be standing not just for yourself, but for every time he tried to break you. Are you ready for that? I met her eyes in the mirror, the streetlights flickering across her face. I am, I whispered. Even if I crawl, I will stand. She nodded once, nothing more. She believed me. We stopped at a small motel on the edge of the historic district, far from the familiar places where anyone might look for us. Rachel had booked it under her name. She helped me inside, easing me onto the bed. My leg throbbed as I propped it up on pillows, the splint rough against the fabric. She placed the X-ray envelope on the nightstand and handed me a bottle of water. Rest, she said, because tomorrow you fight. As she left to get supplies, I stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. Pain clawed through my body, but beneath it, something stronger pulsed. Rick thought the fracture would stop me. He thought drugs and violence would erase the soldier in me. But he forgot that broken bones heal and broken spirits can rise. The night before my wedding had been his triumph. The morning would be mine. Dawn crept through the thin curtains of the motel room, painting the ceiling in pale streaks of gray. I opened my eyes to the ache that had settled deep in my shin, a throbbing reminder that the night before had not been a nightmare, but a brutal reality. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the faint whir of the ceiling fan, the distant hum of traffic, and Rachel moving quietly in the kitchenette, boiling water for coffee. Every breath felt heavy with what lay ahead. My leg was splinted, swollen, wrapped tight, but when I turned my head, the envelope on the nightstand caught my gaze. The X-ray film inside gleamed faintly under the weak light. Proof. I reached for it with trembling fingers, pressing it against my chest, feeling the ridges of the stiff paper. That film was more than a medical image. It was testimony. It was the undeniable truth of what Rick had done. Rachel walked over, a steaming cup in her hand, and sat on the edge of the bed. She studied me with those sharp nurse's eyes that had seen soldiers torn apart and stitched back together. You should not push yourself, Claire, she said gently, but I know you will. Just promise me you will not let pride make you reckless. I knotted my throat tight. I am not walking for pride, I whispered. I am walking because he tried to silence me, and I refuse to stay silent. Rachel squeezed my shoulder and set the coffee down beside me. Then she helped me sit up, guiding my legs over the side of the bed. The first attempt at standing sent fire roaring up my shin. I gasped, clutching the crutches. My arms trembled under the effort, sweat breaking across my brow. Rachel steadied me with one arm, her voice calm, measured. Breathe. Step. Plant. Swing. Again. I forced myself upright, my weight awkwardly balanced the wooden crutches digging into my sides. Every movement sent a jolt of pain up through the fracture, but I gritted my teeth. One step, then another. By the time I reached the bathroom door and back, my body was shaking, but inside me a strange calm began to form. I could do this. I would do this. As I collapsed back onto the bed, Rachel handed me a small bottle of prescribed pain medication. "The doctor said you need this," she reminded me. "Take one, not two. It will dull the edge enough so you can manage." I swallowed the pill with a sip of water, the bitterness clinging to my tongue. Within minutes, the sharp agony softened into a deep ache, still present but no longer unbearable. I leaned back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. My mind drifted to Fort Benning. I remembered the obstacle courses, the long marches, the way the drill instructors shouted until my ears rang. Pain is weakness leaving the body they had drilled into us. At the time, I hated those words. I thought they were empty, a cruel mantra to justify suffering. But lying there with my legs splinted, I understood them differently. Pain was not just weakness leaving. It was also strength being forged. Every blister, every bruise, every sleepless night at training had been preparing me for this moment. Not a battlefield overseas, but a battlefield in my own life. A knock at the door startled me. Rachel peeked through the curtain and then opened it. Ethan stepped in his uniform crisp, his eyes wide when they landed on me. For a heartbeat, he looked ready to storm out and hunt Rick down himself. But then he knelt by my side, his hand closing around mine, steady grounding. "Claire," he whispered, "what did they do to you?" My throat tightened. I wanted to collapse into his arms to let him carry me away from all of it. But instead, I squeezed his hand back and said, "They tried to break me, Ethan. They failed." He brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle, his jaw tight with fury. He was trying to hold back. "You do not have to prove anything," he said. "We can postpone, whatever you need." I shook my head fiercely, feeling tears sting my eyes. "No. If I stay hidden, if I let them win, then everything they did will have meaning. I need to walk into that chapel, not just for us, but for me. For every time he made me feel small." Ethan's eyes searched mine, and then he nodded slowly. "All right, soldier, then we do this together." His words steadied me more than any medication could. We spent the next hour preparing. Rachel helped me into a simple silk slip dress, easing it carefully over the splint. She brushed my hair, pinned the veil lightly, her hands gentle but firm. Ethan checked the crutches, adjusted the pads so they would not cut into my skin. Every small action felt monumental. The pain pressed against me, but the determination burned brighter. As the morning sun grew stronger, light spilling across the bedspread, I knew there was no turning back. I would face them. I would not limp in as their victim. I would walk in as a soldier who refused to surrender. When Ethan said we would do this together, I realized just how deep his loyalty ran. He was not just a fiancé preparing for a wedding. He was a Navy SEAL who had walked into fire with his team and walked back out. That kind of loyalty did not stop at the water's edge, and it did not falter in the face of family betrayal. He stayed by my side in that motel room, pacing as if every muscle in his body was begging for action. I could see the fury in his eyes every time they drifted down to my splinted leg. He kept whispering, "They will not get away with this, Claire. Not while I'm breathing. Rachel, ever the calm strategist, reminded us that emotion could not win the day alone. We needed order proof and witnesses. She held up the X-ray envelope, her voice steady. "This is not just a film, it is a weapon. But we need more. Claire, do you still have the recordings from your camera?" My heart jolted. The memory card was hidden in my duffel bag under my uniform. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. Rachel slid it into her laptop, the glow of the screen lighting her face. We sat in silence as the footage played. The video showed my mother bringing the T-Rex shadow looming, the sound of the crack my muffled scream. It showed Amber laughing. Her phone raised her voice cruel. Even though I had lived it, watching it again sent a cold shiver through me. Ethan's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might break. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening on the laptop. She whispered, This is enough to bury him. But she knew as well as I did that evidence only mattered if it was seen by the right eyes. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and controlled the same voice he must have used in mission briefings. We show this at the chapel. Not tomorrow, not later. We show it in front of everyone. They want a stage, we give them one. My chest tightened. The thought of hundreds of eyes watching my humiliation made my stomach churn. But then I remembered Amber's smirk, Rick's threat, my mother's silence. No, I said firmly. Not my humiliation. Their crime. Rachel nodded once her approval quiet but solid. Ethan called 2 of his teammates who were already in Savannah to attend the wedding. They arrived an hour later, tall men with the same calm intensity etched into their faces. They did not ask unnecessary questions. When Ethan explained what happened, their expressions hardened their loyalty immediate. Whatever you need, one of them said, we've got you. For the first time since the crack of the bat, I felt the ground steady under me. I was not alone. I had an ally in Rachel's careful planning and Ethan's unwavering presence, in the quiet power of men who knew how to stand when others fell. With the footage secured and the X-ray film ready, the next step was figuring out how to make it impossible for Rick to spin the story. Rachel, ever the strategist, said it needed to happen where silence would not be an option. She looked at me and asked, Claire, do you trust the chapel staff? I hesitated. Christ Church on Johnson Square was historic a place of reverence, but its staff had always been polite neutral. They were not allies, but they were not under Rick's thumb either. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. Then we used their AV system. He pulled out his phone, contacting a friend he trusted from Pensacola who specialized in communications equipment. By the next morning, that friend had already spoken with the church's AV coordinator. Arrangements were quietly made. It would not be a slideshow of flowers or family photos flashing across the screen. It would be the truth. When Ethan explained the plan to me, my stomach clenched. I imagined walking into the chapel, every eye on me, and then watching my family's betrayal play larger than life across the walls. The thought made me shake, but Ethan caught my hand, his grip warm and grounding. Claire, he said softly, they humiliated you in secret. Now the world will see who they really are. His words steadied me. Rachel, practical as always, handled the official side. She contacted a police sergeant she had worked with years ago during her nursing shifts in the ER. She explained the situation carefully, avoiding details that could compromise the plan, but securing a promise that officers would be ready to respond if called. She reminded him that there was hard proof, and that this was not just a family squabble but a violent assault. He agreed to be on standby. Having law enforcement prepared gave me a new sense of safety. The night before, I had felt like prey drugged and broken on the carpet. Now, with every ally we gathered, I felt more like a soldier again, building a unit, forming a plan of attack. Ethan's teammates stayed close. One scouted the chapel grounds quietly, noting entrances and exits where Rick might try to make a scene. The other tested the equipment, making sure the footage would play clean and uninterrupted. Their efficiency reminded me of drills at Fort Benning, each man doing his part without needing constant direction. Rachel kept me calm, checking my splint, adjusting the crutches, reminding me to take the medication exactly as prescribed. She never once treated me like a fragile victim. She treated me like a fighter preparing for the hardest march of her life. By the time afternoon shadows stretched across the motel carpet, I realized something I had not felt since childhood. For the first time, I had a family who chose me. Not the one I was born into, but the one I built through trust and loyalty. And in their strength, I found mine. The hours before the ceremony felt like the longest of my life. Rachel had arranged for me to rest in the motel, but rest was impossible. I sat upright on the bed in my simple slip dress veil, draped across the chair beside me, staring at the envelope and the memory card that held my family's sins. Every throb in my shin reminded me of what had been taken from me, but every breath reminded me of what I still had. Ethan's teammates moved quietly in and out, checking watches, confirming details with the AV coordinator, updating Ethan with nods and short reports. They carried themselves with the precision of men used to planning in hostile territory. For them, this was not a mission with maps and weapons. It was a mission of truth. Ethan stood at the window, his back straight, his uniform crisp. The morning light glinted off his insignia, and I realized again why I had said yes to him under the oaks of Forsyth Park. He turned toward me, his eyes softening when they landed on my crutches. "When you walk into that church, Claire, you will not walk alone," he said. His voice was calm, but carried the kind of promise that could not be broken. Rachel came in holding a small kit. She adjusted the padding under my arms, tightened the straps on the splint, and slipped the pain medication into my hand with water. "Take it now," she instructed, "so it steadies you by the time you need to move." I obeyed, swallowing hard, the bitterness sharp but my resolve sharper. She brushed a hand across my cheek, her eyes glistening. "You have already won, Claire. The rest is only showing them." That sentence anchored me. Already won, because the truth was no longer hidden. Proof was no longer buried. For years, Rick had controlled the story, shaping every scene with intimidation and silence. But not this time. When the pill began to take effect, the fire in my leg softened into a bearable ache. I practiced standing, shifting my weight, breathing through the pain. Each small step across the motel carpet was a rehearsal for the moment to come. Step plant swing. Again. My arms steadied, my balance improved. My body ached, but my will surged higher. At last, Ethan checked his watch and nodded to Rachel. "It is time." She gathered the envelope, the laptop, and the cables. The teammates lifted their gear. Ethan held out his hand, palm open, steady as a rock. I placed mine into his, my crutches tucked under my arms, my heart pounding. Together, we stepped out of the motel room and into the bright Savannah sunlight. The air smelled of salt and magnolia. The church bells in the distance began to ring. It was time to face them. The streets around Johnson Square bustled with life, but inside the stone walls of Christ Church, the air felt frozen, waiting. As the car pulled up, I stared through the window at the tall white steeple piercing the Savannah sky. My stomach twisted not from nerves about vows, but from the weight of what I was about to do. Rachel climbed out first, clutching the envelope of X-rays. Ethan's teammates moved with quiet precision, carrying the laptop and cables. Ethan himself circled to my side, opening the door and offering his hand, his eyes locked on mine. "Ready, soldier." I tightened my grip on the crutches, the splint stiff against my leg, pain already burning. But I nodded. "Ready." When I swung myself out, the crowd outside turned. Guests in pressed suits and bright dresses fell silent as they saw me. Their eyes widened at the sight of the bride with a cast in crutches. A murmur rippled through them, confusion, pity, curiosity. I held my head high. They would see pain, but they would also see defiance. Step by step, I made my way toward the wide double doors. Each strike of the crutch on stone echoed like a drumbeat. The ushers whispered, unsure whether to offer help. Ethan walked beside me, his uniform gleaming, his stride steady. The contrast between my limp and his strength told its own story. Inside the church glowed with stained glass and candlelight. Pastor Michael stood at the altar, his face shifting from surprise to concern as he saw me. The pews were packed city officials Rick had insisted on, neighbors, friends, even the mayor. At the front row sat my mother, Susan, pale and tense, and Amber radiant in a gown more dazzling than my own, her smirk already curling as she whispered something to a friend. Rick stood tall in his suit, his shoulders back, his expression smug, as if daring me to collapse in front of everyone. The organ began to play slow and solemn. The guests rose. I moved down the aisle, each step a knife of pain, but each step a victory. Phones rose quietly, people recording what they thought was a tragedy. They had no idea what they were about to witness. When Ethan and I reached the altar, Pastor Michael leaned toward me. "Claire, are you sure you want to continue?" he whispered, his eyes flicking down to my leg. I steadied myself on the crutches, my voice low but firm. More than ever. He nodded slowly and began the ceremony. His voice carried through the vaulted ceiling, speaking of vows of unity, of love. But as he spoke, Rachel slipped to the side of the chapel, handing the laptop to the AV coordinator. Ethan's teammates moved quietly into position, checking cables, nodding once to confirm. My heart pounded as I waited, every nerve stretched taut. Then the moment came. Just as Pastor Michael spoke the words about truth and faith, the lights dimmed and the large screen flickered to life. The guests gasped, murmurs swelling. At first, they thought it was a slideshow of family photos, but then the first image froze them all. Me in my bedroom sipping tea, my eyes heavy. Rick's shadow entering the glint of the bat. Then the sound. Crack. The church fell silent. My muffled scream filled the speakers, my mother's whisper of protest, Amber's cruel laugh. The image of me collapsing onto the carpet played in front of 200 witnesses. Gasps, cries, whispers rippled like waves. Susan covered her mouth, tears spilling. Amber's smirk faltered her phone, clattering to the floor. Rick shifted his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists. And then Rachel's voice cut through calm, authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am a registered nurse. This is Claire Donovan's X-ray taken last night at Memorial Health." She held up the film to the light, the fracture line stark and undeniable. "This is the damage caused by the man sitting in your front row." The church erupted. The moment Rachel lifted the X-ray, the whispers turned into a storm. Guests leaned forward, craning their necks to see some with hands clasped over their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Pastor Michael froze mid-sentence, his Bible still open in his hands. He looked from the screen to me to Rick and back again, his face etched with horror. The footage replayed once more, the crack of bone echoing against the stone walls, Amber's laugh slicing through the silence like broken glass. People gasped audibly, recoiling in their seats. One woman muttered, "Lord have mercy." The mayor turned in his pew, staring at Rick with open disgust. I steadied myself on the crutches, my voice trembling but clear. "This is what happened the night before my wedding. This is who Rick Holloway really is." My words, carried through the chapel microphone, amplified, undeniable. Rick shot to his feet, his face red, his voice booming. "Lies. All of it lies. She is trying to destroy me because she cannot control herself." He jabbed a finger toward me, spittle flying, his suit rumpled as his composure cracked. But Ethan stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his voice like steel. "Enough. You tried to break a soldier. Instead, you exposed yourself." The room hushed again, every eye drawn to him in his Navy SEAL uniform, the weight of authority in every word. One of his teammates signaled subtly toward the back, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped in, moving down the aisle with deliberate calm. Rachel handed them the envelope, her voice steady as she explained. "The film matches the footage. The doctors at Memorial Health confirmed the fracture. I can testify." The officers examined the evidence, then turned to Rick. "Sir, you need to come with us." Rick's bravado faltered. He looked around as if searching for allies, but all he found were glares, whispers, and shaking heads. Susan wept openly, her shoulders shaking. Amber scrambled to pick up her phone, her face pale as she realized the video she thought would humiliate me had become the noose around her father's neck. Rick's voice grew desperate, louder, uglier. "She is my daughter. This is family business. You have no right." But the officers ignored him, pulling his hands behind his back, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the church. Gasps rippled again, followed by a murmur of approval. Even applause from the back rows. Pastor Michael stepped forward, his voice grave but firm. "This house is for truth and for love, not violence. What has been revealed today must not be hidden." My knees trembled, the pain in my leg pulsing with every heartbeat. But I straightened as tall as the crutches allowed. I turned to the crowd, my voice steady though tears burned my eyes. My whole life he told me I was weak. He tried to silence me with fear. But strength is not measured by fists. Strength is standing here now. For the first time in my life, I saw respect reflected back at me from faces that had once pitied me. Neighbors who had turned a blind eye now looked at me with shame in their eyes, as if realizing too late what they had ignored. And Amber, standing frozen, her glittering gown suddenly garish, could not lift her chin. She had laughed at my pain, but now the laughter was gone, replaced by the weight of exposure. Rick was led past the pews, struggling, his voice rising in curses that only made the crowd recoil further. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him, and the silence that followed was unlike any I had ever heard. It was not pity. It was reckoning. For a long moment, the chapel held its breath. The image of Rick being let out in handcuffs seemed to linger in the air like smoke after a fire. My chest heaved, my arms ached from the crutches, but I refused to falter. Ethan stood beside me, his hand steady on my back, and Rachel remained at the side aisle, her eyes fixed on me with fierce pride. Pastor Michael cleared his throat, his voice still reverberating from the chaos. He looked directly at me, then at the congregation. Truth has been brought into the light. It is up to us to witness it, not turn away. His words seemed to snap the guests out of their stunned silence. Murmurs swelled voices overlapping. Some leaned across pews to whisper. Others shook their heads as though still trying to absorb what they had seen. The mayor rose, slowly turned toward me, and gave a solemn nod before leaving the pew. His gesture carried weight. It was not sympathy. It was respect. Susan, pale and trembling, clutched the edge of the pew as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes darted between me and the doors where Rick had disappeared. She looked shattered, not by loyalty, but by the collapse of the lie she had helped sustain for years. Amber slumped into her seat, her phone forgotten, her hands shaking. The shimmer of her dress looked cheap now, every sparkle mocking her attempt to outshine me. For the first time, she had no words. The screen behind me went black, the footage over, but its echoes filled every corner of the sanctuary. Rachel stepped forward, holding the microphone Pastor Michael had set aside. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said firmly, "this is not just a broken leg. This is years of abuse hidden under silence. And this is what silence allows." Her voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. People shifted uncomfortably, realizing she was not just talking about Rick. She was talking about all of them, the neighbors who ignored bruises, the relatives who dismissed whispers, the community that chose comfort over truth. A heavy hush fell again. Ethan squeezed my hand and I drew a breath, my voice raw but strong. He thought breaking me would end me, but soldiers do not break. We rise. The words trembled at first, but as they carried through the speakers, I saw heads lift, eyes glisten, people nod. It was not just my declaration. It was defiance on behalf of every person who had been told to stay quiet, to endure, to obey. Pastor Michael stepped closer, his expression solemn. "Claire, Ethan," he said gently, "we can continue or we can pause. The choice is yours." I looked at Ethan, at the man who had held me steady through every shadow, and I shook my head. "Not pause. Continue." Ethan's eyes softened with pride. The pastor nodded, and slowly, deliberately, he returned to the vows. The ceremony resumed, the air still heavy, but charged now with something new. Every word of promise I spoke felt forged in fire. Every line Ethan answered rang with conviction. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, the applause was not tentative. It was thunderous. It was release. The organ swelled, voices rose, and though my leg ached and my body trembled, I felt taller than I had ever felt in my life, because this was not just a wedding. This was justice made public. This was the end of silence. The echo of applause still rang in my ears when the chapel doors closed behind Rick and the officers who led him away, but the celebration did not erase the shock that lingered in every corner. Guests whispered in small clusters, their faces pale and drawn. Some looked ashamed, others indignant that they had been tricked into believing the Holloway facade for so long. I stood steady on my crutches, breathing hard, my leg throbbing beneath the splint, but inside me a strange calm began to settle. The truth was out, and it could not be put back. Rachel gathered the X-ray envelope and slipped it safely into her bag, while Ethan's teammates quietly packed up the laptop. Their movements were efficient, but their eyes never stopped scanning, making sure no one approached me without permission. When the ceremony ended, a line of guests formed not to offer congratulations in the usual sense, but to murmur words that sounded more like confessions. One elderly neighbor, who had lived across from us for years, gripped my hand, his voice breaking. "Claire, I thought you were just a quiet girl who kept to herself. I should have seen. I should have asked. Forgive me." His apology hit harder than I expected. For years I had felt invisible, dismissed as dramatic or difficult. Now those same people were seeing me for the first time. Susan stayed in the front pew long after the crowd began to disperse. Her face was streaked with mascara, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. When I finally walked toward her, the silence between us pressed heavier than any words. She whispered, "I never thought it would go this far." I wanted to believe him. I wanted peace. My throat tightened. Peace at my expense. She nodded weakly, unable to meet my eyes. Amber slipped out the side door before anyone could confront her. Her friends whispered behind their hands, phones buzzing with the video already spreading beyond the chapel walls. I knew her glittering life built on appearances was unraveling as quickly as Rick's empire. Outside, the police cruiser sat with Rick inside, his head lowered, but his mouth still moving in curses I could not hear. Reporters had already gathered cameras, flashing microphones thrust forward. The Savannah Morning News had caught wind of what had happened, and by nightfall, the footage would be everywhere. I stepped into the sunlight, Ethan at my side, Rachel close behind. The humid air wrapped around me sticky and heavy, but it carried a strange sense of cleansing. One of the officers approached his notepad ready. "Miss Donovan," he said respectfully, "we will need your official statement. We already have the video and medical records, but your testimony will seal it." I nodded steady. "I will give it." For once, my voice did not shake when I spoke. The statement took hours, every detail written, every word cross-checked. By the time we finished, the afternoon sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the square. Reporters swarmed, but Ethan shielded me with his arm, guiding me to the waiting car. Rachel followed, her bag clutched tight, her expression fierce. As the car pulled away, I looked back one last time at the church at the square, where so many tourists walked without knowing the storm that had just broken inside those walls. My leg burned, my body screamed for rest, but my spirit stood taller than it ever had. Rick was no longer just my tormentor. He was a criminal in custody, and I was no longer just his victim. I was his witness. The ride from the chapel to Rachel's apartment passed in a blur, the streetlights of Savannah glowing like watchful eyes. Ethan drove jaw tight, his hand never far from mine. Rachel sat in the back seat with me, her presence steady, her nurse's bag still resting on her lap. She leaned forward once and whispered, "Do not let tonight trick you into thinking the fight is over. Courtrooms and headlines will come next. You must be ready." Her words carried the weight of someone who had walked through long battles before. By the time we reached her small apartment near Forsyth Park, my body trembled with exhaustion. Ethan helped me inside, guiding me to the couch while Rachel prepared ice packs and pain medication the hospital had prescribed. She spread the X-ray images on the coffee table, her finger tracing the clean line of the fracture. Non-displaced, she reminded us. Painful but manageable. With the crutches you can move. With rest, you will heal. But with this film, you will also prove. I stared at the ghostly image of my leg bones. Proof. For years, my word had never been enough against Rick's booming voice and Susan's careful silence. Now I had evidence that could not be twisted into drama or exaggeration. My phone buzzed again and again that evening. Messages from fellow MPs at Fort Benning, from neighbors who had once looked through me, from old teachers who had seen bruises but never asked. Some messages were kind, others shocked, but all of them carried the same undertone. "We finally see you." The Savannah Morning News released a breaking alert before midnight. The headline blared, "Local business owner arrested at daughter's wedding after abuse allegations." The article detailed how Rick Holloway, owner of Holloway Auto on Abercorn Street, had been arrested for aggravated assault and endangering the welfare of a minor turned adult. My name was printed clearly, my age, my military role. My stomach twisted, seeing myself reduced to a headline, but I knew this was the cost of light. Ethan scrolled through comments on the online article. "Claire, people are furious. Half the town is saying they always suspected something. The other half is shocked, but they are siding with you. Holloway's customers are already posting about boycotts." I closed my eyes, picturing the rows of cars at his shop, the men who once slapped him on the back, now turning away. The empire he built on fear and charm was crumbling. Rachel added quietly, "The district attorney will not let this pass. With the X-rays, the video, and the witnesses, this will not be dismissed as family drama. It is assault, plain and simple." Weeks later, her prediction proved true. The case moved quickly. Rick's charges expanded after investigators uncovered years of financial fraud tied to his business. Customers came forward alleging he had overcharged or falsified repairs. What began as one crime against me snowballed into a reckoning of everything he had hidden. Susan tried to visit me once at Rachel's apartment. She stood at the door with a bouquet of white lilies, her face pale, her eyes swollen. "Claire," she whispered, "I never meant for you to suffer like this. I thought keeping peace with him was the only way." My chest tightened, but I held firm. "Peace that breaks your child is no peace at all." She cried, but I could not open the door. Forgiveness is not always possible. Amber disappeared from Savannah society almost overnight. Her friends stopped answering her calls once the video of her laughing in the background went viral. She dropped out of classes at Georgia Southern and deleted her social media. The last I heard, she had moved to stay with distant cousins out of state. She thought she had been filming a joke. Instead, she had filmed evidence. The fallout did not end with family. At Fort Benning, word of my ordeal reached my commanding officer. Instead of pity, I was met with respect. "Donovan, he told me you've shown the kind of resilience we try to teach. You didn't let pain stop you from standing tall. You'll wear that scar with honor." His words steadied me during nights when the ache in my leg refused to quiet. Physical therapy stretched across months. I learned to balance to walk again without wincing, to trust my leg to carry me. Each step felt like defiance. Each mile on the treadmill was proof that Rick had failed. He had tried to break me, but I was healing stronger. The public trial took place in Savannah's Chatham County Courthouse. I sat with Ethan and Rachel on either side. The X-rays enlarged on a projector. The video from the chapel played frame by frame. Rick sat across the room in shackles, his once confident smirk replaced with tight fury. The jury listened in silence, their eyes hard. The verdict came after only 2 hours of deliberation. Guilty. Aggravated assault. Sentenced to 15 years. The courtroom gasped. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Justice had spoken. When the gavel struck, I leaned on my crutches, stood tall, and looked directly at him. "You cannot hurt me anymore." His eyes flickered, and for the first time I saw fear. The morning after the verdict, I woke in Rachel's apartment with sunlight pouring across the worn wooden floor. For the first time in months, I felt as if the weight pressing on my chest had lifted. My leg still ached from the fracture, the scar tissue tightening as I shifted, but inside me something had unlocked. Rick's shadow had been dragged into the open. He no longer lurked behind closed doors, no longer dictated silence. He was a prisoner of the system he thought he could manipulate. That thought was the first sip of freedom. Ethan brewed coffee in the tiny kitchen, humming quietly, his voice low and steady. He had stayed by my side through every hearing, every therapy session, every moment when doubt whispered that maybe I was still broken. He leaned against the counter and looked at me with the same eyes he had worn at the chapel, unshaken, unafraid, proud. "You're still standing, Claire," he said simply, and those words meant more than 1,000 promises. The doctors at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta had given me a clear path to recovery. Surgery wasn't necessary. The fracture was healing with the support of the brace and careful physical therapy. They had prescribed pain medication for the worst days, but also reminded me that movement would be the key to regaining strength. At first, the exercises were humiliating, bending, flexing tiny steps with resistance bands. I felt clumsy, a soldier reduced to a stumble, but Rachel reminded me constantly that healing was its own battle. "Pain is weakness, leaving the body." She quoted my training back to me, smiling when I glared at her for using my own motto. Slowly, the crutches gave way to a cane, and the cane to careful, steady steps on my own. Each milestone felt monumental. The first time I walked unassisted across Rachel's living room, Ethan clapped softly as if applauding a triumph larger than the courtroom's verdict. The wedding that had been stolen from me in Savannah could not be reclaimed, but Ethan and I refused to let that moment define us. Instead, we planned a smaller ceremony, private and simple, with only those who had stood as my true allies. At a quiet chapel near Pensacola, surrounded by his Navy teammates and a few friends from Fort Benning, I walked slowly but on my own power down a short aisle. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt like a blessing, not a spotlight. When Ethan said his vows, there was no pretense, no polished Southern performance. He promised loyalty, protection, and respect, the very things I had been denied in my own family. I answered with my own promise to never hide, to never let silence cover truth again. The kiss that sealed it was not staged for society. It was ours, raw and real, and for the first time I understood what it meant to start a life without chains. Healing did not mean forgetting. My leg bore a faint scar from the brace, a thin line that traced the memory of that night. At first, I hated it, avoided mirrors, tugged at long pants. But during one session with other service members at a Wounded Warrior project, meeting a Marine with a prosthetic arm looked me straight in the eye. Scars are proof that you survived, not that you failed. That sentence reshaped how I looked at myself. I began to wear shorts during therapy, letting the scar show, letting the story breathe. When people asked, I told them plainly. My stepfather tried to break me. He failed. I'm still here. And every time I said it, I felt the truth harden inside me, a shield that could never be taken. My mother reached out again after the sentencing. She called from a borrowed phone, her voice shaking. "Claire, please, he's gone. I know I failed you. I know I chose silence too many times, but I need my daughter." Tears blurred my vision as I listened, but I could not grant her what she wanted. I told her softly, "I am no longer your silence. You made your choices. Now, I am making mine." And I hung up. The ache in my chest was sharp, but it was cleaner than the rot of living under her shadow. Sometimes survival means closing doors permanently. Amber never returned to Savannah society. The video of her laughing during my assault had spread too far. She had become a symbol of cruelty, a cautionary tale. Old friends distanced themselves, sponsors cut ties, and her name became a whispered reminder of what complicity looked like. Part of me pitied her, but I knew pity would not heal either of us. She had chosen her side. She would live with the consequences. As for me, my life moved forward. At Fort Benning, I returned to duty slower at first, but determined. My commanding officer assigned me lighter shifts until the doctors cleared me for full activity. When I finally passed the running test again, leg throbbing but intact, I felt as victorious as I had the day I first pinned on my MP badge. My peers treated me differently now, not with pity, but with respect. Donovan, one of them, said during chow, "You didn't just survive your family. You beat them on their own stage. That's more than most people ever get to do." Ethan and I moved into a small rental near base, nothing fancy but full of peace. On quiet nights, we cooked pasta together, laughed over bad television, or walked slowly through the neighborhood as my leg regained strength. These simple moments became more precious than any grand Savannah reception could have given me, because in them there was no fear of footsteps on the stairs, no tension of waiting for the next blow. There was only the steady rhythm of a life we were building together, brick by brick, scar by scar. One evening, Rachel joined us for dinner. She raised a glass of sweet tea and said, "Claire, I am proud of you. You took the worst night of your life and turned it into testimony. That's what soldiers do. They fight battles others can't see." I blinked back tears, realizing how much her support had meant, how different the story would have been without her. In time, I began speaking at survivor groups, especially with other young service members who carried their own hidden battles. I shared my x-rays, my courtroom story, my scar. I told them, "You are not defined by what broke you. You are defined by how you rise after." Each time I spoke, I felt lighter. The story was no longer just mine. It became a weapon against silence. Healing was not a straight line. There were nights I woke sweating from dreams of Rick's voice, mornings when the ache in my leg made me curse. But healing was steady, and it was mine. Standing at a podium at Fort Benning months later, addressing a group of cadets, I realized I had become what I needed when I was 16. Proof that survival is possible, that strength can grow from pain. I lifted my head, looked out at their faces, and said, "Rick thought breaking my leg would break me, but soldiers rise from the pain." And in that moment, I knew I was free. When I look back on the night before my wedding, there is still a part of me that struggles to believe it happened. The tea, the fall, the crack of bone, the humiliation of waking up in a hospital bed when I should have been preparing to walk down an aisle. But the scar on my leg and the images on that X-ray do not let me forget. They remind me daily of what cruelty can look like when disguised as family, and they remind me of how far I have come. Rick thought that if he broke my body, he could break my spirit. He believed that fear and pain would silence me the way it had when I was a child. But instead, he created the stage where his own mask shattered. In front of 200 people, he revealed who he truly was. And in front of those same people, I revealed who I was becoming. Not a victim, but a survivor. Not a weak girl, but a soldier. I often think of my younger self, the teenager standing in a hallway with bruises she could not explain, staring at a locked bedroom door, wondering if anyone would ever see the truth. I want to tell her, hold on. One day you will stand in a courtroom and speak without shaking. One day you will walk into a chapel, not with shame, but with strength. One day the world will hear you and they will believe. The most painful part was not Rick's violence. It was my mother's silence, my sister's mockery, the complicity that grew in the spaces where love should have been. That kind of betrayal leaves wounds deeper than bone. But I have learned that healing does not require their apologies. Healing required me to step out from the shadows and choose my own voice. The military taught me discipline, endurance, and the meaning of service. But this experience taught me something different. Courage is not always on the battlefield. Sometimes courage is walking on crutches into a room where everyone expects you to disappear. Sometimes courage is saying out loud, "This happened to me," even when people whisper that family matters should stay behind closed doors. And sometimes courage is simply choosing not to go back when the people who hurt you come knocking asking for forgiveness they have not earned. Ethan has often told me that scars are the body's way of writing its history. My scar tells a story not of defeat but of transformation. I see it every morning when I lace my boots, and instead of shame, I feel gratitude, because it reminds me of what I survived, and it reminds me that I am still here, still standing, still serving. Rachel calls me a warrior in 2 uniforms, one of the military and one of survival. I like that, because when I stand before younger cadets or survivor groups and share my story, I am wearing both. I tell them the truth that I cried, that I doubted, that I wanted to give up. I tell them that pain does not vanish overnight, but I also tell them that brokenness is not the end of the story, that sometimes the most broken people become the strongest warriors. Savannah still carries whispers of that day. Sometimes when I visit, strangers stop me on the street. They tell me they were in the crowd or that they read about it in the paper, and they thank me for having the courage to stand up. I never know how to answer. I did not feel brave when I was lying on the floor that night gasping for air. I did not feel brave when I stumbled on crutches to the front of the chapel. But maybe bravery is not a feeling. Maybe bravery is simply refusing to stay silent one more day. My story is not neat. It does not tie up with reconciliations and family dinners. My mother still lives in Savannah, clinging to her image of Southern grace. Amber is still gone her life. A series of unanswered calls and deleted accounts. Rick is still in prison, serving a sentence that will stretch across years of his life. And me, I am building something new. I have scars and memories, but I also have Ethan, a career, and a future that belongs to me. If you are listening to this and carrying your own hidden battle, I want you to know you are not alone. Whatever they did to you, however they tried to break you, it does not have to be the end. Your voice matters, your pain matters, and your healing, though it may feel impossible, is possible. Rick thought he wrote the ending to my story when he lifted that bat, but I wrote the next chapter when I lifted my head in that chapel. And I will keep writing it every day that I wake up, put on my uniform, and choose to live free. So I leave you with this thought. Have you ever seen someone become stronger after being broken? Maybe you have lived it yourself. Maybe you have watched it in a friend. I want to hear your story. Share it below. Because when we speak, when we share, when we refuse to hide, we break the silence that abusers depend on. And together, we prove that no matter how deep the fracture, the human spirit can rise.